Between the end of the Civil War and the 1890 announcement by the U.S. Census Bureau that the frontier line was no longer discernible, the American West underwent a transformation measurable in cattle tallies, court dockets, railroad mileage, and the shrinking of indigenous land. Millions of Longhorns moved north out of Texas along named routes, the Chisholm, the Western, the Goodnight, Loving, toward railheads in Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming. From roughly 1866 to 1888, those drives connected grassland to slaughterhouse and converted animals worth a few dollars on the southern range into beef that fed an industrializing nation. The popular image would later reduce this period to a stage for heroic shootouts. The records show something more systematic: wage labor conducted on horseback, municipal regulation in boomtowns, federal marshals extending court authority across vast districts, and a set of policies, rail grants, homesteads, allotments, that reordered power on indigenous homelands. Kindly comment, share and subscribe for more history. The context was national and immediate. The Union victory in 1865 released men, money, and appetite for expansion. Railroad corporations, buoyed by federal land grants and bonds, laid track across plains and mountains, culminating in the transcontinental link of 1869 and expanding rapidly thereafter through feeder lines that reached deep into stock country. Telegraph wires followed the rails and made orders, warrants, and prices travel with new speed. The Homestead Act of 1862 had already set the framework for smallholder claims, and the post-war years brought intense migration. The period's end came not because the West filled to its edges, but because settlement became dispersed enough that a clear statistical boundary between settled and unsettled counties disappeared from census maps. In the same generation, federal Indian policy shifted from treaties with sovereign nations toward unilateral statutes and executive orders, culminating in the Dawes Act of 1887, which broke many reservations into individual allotments and opened so-called surplus lands to non-native entry. The sum of these forces gave the era its tempo: markets accelerating, law consolidating, and indigenous autonomy constricting. The cattle trade illustrates how technology and labor produce predictable outcomes on an unpredictable landscape. In post-war Texas, Longhorns proliferated with little local demand. Farther north and east, urban markets could pay 10 times the Texas price. The solution was organizational: assemble herds in spring, hire crews of a dozen or more hands under a trail boss, attach a chuck wagon and a remuda of spare horses, and move north toward rail. Abilene, reached by Joseph McCoy's promotions after 1867, became an early destination. Ellsworth, Wichita, and Dodge City followed as rail lines shifted. Ogallala and Cheyenne drew herds as the frontier of steel moved. Drives took 2 to 3 months in good conditions and demanded a repertoire of skills inherited largely from the vaquero tradition of northern Mexico: high-horn saddles meant for roping, rawhide lariats, chaparreras for brush, and handling methods that controlled herd movement while minimizing panic. The vocabulary, lasso, bronco, rodeo, remuda, preserves this lineage. Working conditions were harsh and methodical. The chuck wagon, popularized by Texas rancher Charles Goodnight, carried flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, basic medicines, and spare tack. Daily tasks included branding, doctoring injuries, swimming rivers, and night herding to keep cattle from stampeding. Wages ran roughly $25 to $40 per month plus board, proportionally decent pay for the era but hard-earned, and hazards were environmental more often than human. River crossings killed men and cattle, lightning struck riders on open prairie, horses fell, exposure and accidents were constant threats. These facts complicate later romantic images because they show an industry built on discipline, logistics, and endurance rather than on constant gunplay. Cowtowns at the end of the trails, Abilene, Ellsworth, Wichita, Dodge City, Ogallala, Cheyenne, acted as seasonal pressure valves where money changed hands and civic order was tested. Contrary to legend, many of these towns adopted ordinances to protect commerce: weapon checks at the city limits, fines for disorder, curfews. Violence occurred, especially where large payrolls met alcohol and gambling, but local government existed and tried to keep trade predictable. City councils funded police, marshals enforced bylaws, justices of the peace held hearings. The widely repeated picture of unregulated chaos collapses under the weight of surviving minutes and municipal codes. Law extended beyond town limits through a layered system of jurisdiction. U.S. Marshals executed federal warrants across territories and Indian country. The most famous federal bench was that of Judge Isaac C. Parker in Fort Smith, Arkansas, whose court from 1875 held jurisdiction over wide reaches of Indian territory. Deputy U.S. Marshals working out of Fort Smith, including Bass Reeves, one of the most effective officers of the era, logged hundreds of arrests across difficult ground by relying on informant networks, knowledge of terrain, and persistence that mattered more than any single firearm. Municipal law officers in cowtowns operated within local politics and budgets. James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok served as Marshal of Abilene in 1871, Tom Bear River Smith, an earlier marshal known for subduing troublemakers with minimal gunfire, was killed in the line of duty in 1870. Farther southwest, the Texas Rangers evolved from militia-style companies into state law enforcement with mixed reputation, celebrated fieldcraft and rapid response on one side. Episodes of lethal abuse against Mexican and Tejano communities on the other, especially during unrest in the borderlands. Law in the West was not the absence of government, it was government stretched thin, contested, and increasingly professional. The period also produced names associated with crime not because crimes were constant but because the targets, banks, express companies, railroads, symbolized modernity. The James Younger Gang, led by brothers Jesse and Frank, conducted train and bank robberies in the 1870s before Jesse's death in 1882. The Wild Bunch around Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid operated into the 1890s with a handful of high-profile raids. Sam Bass robbed trains in Texas and was killed in 1878. These men were few, their exploits were magnified by newspapers eager for sensation and by the novelty of attacking the new arteries of finance and transport. Express companies and railroads responded with detectives, better safes, and coordination with law enforcement. As crime modernized, so did pursuit. Beneath the spectacle ran conflicts over land, water, and grass that defined rural politics. The open range depended on unfenced grazing and common access to water. Joseph Glidden's 1874 patent for barbed wire transformed that commons by making fencing cheap and effective. Ranchers who had driven herds now sought to secure range, homesteaders claimed quarter sections under federal law, sheep operations expanded into contested grass. Fence-cutting wars flared in parts of Texas and elsewhere as people resisted enclosures or defended them, and legislatures criminalized the cutting of wire. Sheep and cattle tensions periodically turned violent. Two conflicts illustrate how property and power collided. In New Mexico's Lincoln County in 1878, a rivalry between mercantile houses escalated into countywide violence that drew in ranchers and hired guns. Henry McCarty, remembered as Billy the Kid, became its most famous participant, and Sheriff Pat Garrett killed him in 1881. In Wyoming's Johnson County War of 1892, large cattle interests imported gunmen to target alleged rustlers. Their campaign collapsed into a siege at the TA Ranch. U.S. troops intervened, prosecutions faltered. The outcome underlined the influence of corporate capital and state power when property claims were in dispute. All of this unfolded on lands long inhabited and governed by indigenous nations whose own politics and economies were reshaped by U.S. expansion. Railroads cut through hunting grounds and brought commercial bison hunting to scales that decimated herds in the 1870s and 1880s. The loss of bison, central to the cultures and subsistence of many plains nations, was a catastrophe engineered by market demand and often abetted by officials who recognized its strategic effect. Military campaigns framed civil policy, the Red River War of 1874-75 against Southern Plains nations. The Great Sioux War of 1876-77 following conflicts over the Black Hills and northern routes, the Nez Perce War of 1877 as the government enforced reservation confinement, and the drawn-out Apache Wars that ended with Geronimo's surrender in 1886. After 1871, Congress ended treaty-making with tribes as sovereign nations, the Dawes Act of 1887 fragmented communal landholdings into individual allotments and declared surplus lands open to non-native settlers, accelerating dispossession. In December 1890, U.S. troops killed hundreds of Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek during an operation to disarm a band moving toward Pine Ridge Agency, an event widely recognized by historians as a massacre. That year's census statement about the end of the frontier line and the killing at Wounded Knee mark, together, how administrative closure and lethal force coincided. The open-range cattle system ended not solely by policy but by weather interacting with human decisions. Barbed wire and windmill pumps concentrated grazing and encouraged overstocking in favorable years. When the winter of 1886–87 brought sustained cold and blizzards across the northern plains, underfed herds died in enormous numbers, carcasses lay in drifts revealed by spring thaw. Investor-driven outfits collapsed or reorganized, and ranching adapted with smaller, fenced pastures, winter feed, improved breeds, and more careful accounting. The working cowboy's role shifted from seasonal drives to year-round ranch labor tied to rail spurs and local markets. The cattle industry survived, the shape of the work changed. Urban growth tracked the rails and minerals. Mining booms turned camps into towns, Leadville, Deadwood, Tombstone, each with a mixture of legal order and volatility. Denver and Cheyenne matured into regional centers with newspapers, courts, and civic institutions. Immigration was integral to the build-out. Chinese laborers constructed some of the most difficult railroad segments and later faced the restrictions of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major federal law to ban immigration by nationality. European migrants from multiple countries settled farm and ranch land. Black families moved west seeking opportunity and relative autonomy, including in ranch work where a substantial minority of trail hands were black by many estimates. Women's labor underpinned homesteads and towns, running ranches and businesses, teaching school, providing medical care, and establishing civic organizations. Their contributions were essential even when early memorialization favored male figures. By the 1890s, territories converted to states at an accelerating pace, North and South Dakota, Montana, and Washington in 1889, Idaho and Wyoming in 1890, Utah in 1896, Oklahoma in 1907 out of Indian and Oklahoma territories. County maps multiplied, tax rolls thickened, sheriffs and city police departments adopted more bureaucratic structures, the U.S. Marshals Service functioned with stronger communications. The era of the theatrical gunfighter waned, even as lynching and extra-legal violence persisted in some areas into the 20th century. Ranching and farming settled into tighter margins governed by water rights, grazing leases, and credit. Irrigation projects and, later, federal reclamation would reshape parts of the arid West. The administrative fabric, land offices, courts, school districts, made frontier language less descriptive at the local level, whatever power it retained in national rhetoric. Memory took a different path. As the West was being regulated and fenced, it was also being marketed. William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill, created traveling Wild West exhibitions beginning in the 1880s that toured the United States and Europe with sharpshooting demonstrations, riding displays, and reenactments that simplified complex events into spectacles. Dime novels had already given the public thinly fictionalized, true accounts of lawmen and outlaws. In the 20th century, radio, film, and television standardized the Western genre with moral binaries and archetypes: the lone sheriff, the honorable bandit, the helpless settler, the one-dimensional Indian. These productions sometimes used the names of real people: Hickok, Earp, Billy the Kid, Bass Reeves, Butch Cassidy, but detached them from the bureaucratic and economic context that made their actions possible. The myth traveled well because it was portable, emotionally satisfying, and useful in national self-description. A more precise view of the period yields several durable conclusions. The first is that the West's economy rested on systems rather than on solitary heroics. The cowboy was a skilled employee in a supply chain linked by contracts, timetables, and brand books. Lawmen were officers inside municipal, county, and federal hierarchies funded by taxpayers and constrained by courts. Outlaws exploited the same networks, rail schedules, remote depots, publicity, that modernized the West. The second is that many Western towns regulated weapons and behavior to protect commerce. Ordinances requiring visitors to check guns were not rare, they were tools for keeping streets usable when herds arrived and payrolls were in pockets. The third is that environmental limits mattered as much as political ambition. Overgrazing before the severe winter of 1886–87, the collapse of bison herds, and later dust storms in the early 20th century show how semi-arid landscapes impose costs when treated as if they were humid eastern farms. Diversity is central to the factual record and corrective to early portrayals. Mexican and Tejano vaqueros supplied the techniques without which the trail drives would have faltered. Black cowboys made up a significant share of crews and found wage work and a measure of autonomy on the range, even as towns enforced racial segregation. Some native riders hired on in a wage economy that was expanding even as federal policy confined their nations to reservations. Chinese workers built the infrastructure that made cattle shipments possible and then faced exclusion by law. Women across ethnicities were present in every sector: ranching, business, education, medicine, even when their names appeared less often in ledgers and newspapers. Treating these participants as peripheral is a distortion, they are at the center of how the region functioned. If the aftermath of the classic, Wild West era is measured in institutions, the tally is clear. County courthouses replaced ad hoc hearings, school terms became regular, rodeos preserved range skills as sport, stockgrowers associations standardized roundups and branding, irrigation districts and water law organized scarcity. If the legacy is measured in culture, it is the persistence of a myth that equates distance with freedom and personal resolve with public order. That myth is not purely false, it contains genuine courage and endurance, but it is selective. It overlooks how railroads, banks, and government structured choices, it minimizes the costs borne by indigenous nations, and it assumes that decisive individuals operated outside of systems when the opposite was usually true. Seeing the West clearly also clarifies the nation that absorbed it. The period shows how the United States used law, capital, and force to integrate territory. It reveals how local regulation supported markets even when rhetoric celebrated unregulated freedom. It demonstrates how technology, barbed wire, windmills, telegraphs, reorganized social life at relatively low cost per unit. And it leaves open questions about memory, why the country later preferred to remember gunfights rather than ordinances, or lone riders rather than payrolls. The answer lies partly in entertainment economics and partly in national self-fashioning. A story about individual character is easier to carry than a story about committees, contracts, and climate. The conclusion returns to the simple measurements that anchor the subject. From 1866 through the late 1880s, millions of cattle crossed the plains along routes determined by grass, water, and rail. Towns enforced rules to protect seasonal commerce, then grew into cities with permanent institutions. Federal and territorial courts pushed jurisdiction outward through deputies who often succeeded by patience more than by speed with a pistol. Outlaws existed but were scarce, their fame derived from attacking new symbols of wealth and from newspapers hungry for copy. Barbed wire and winter weather ended an economic system built on movement and replaced it with one built on enclosures and feed. Indigenous nations endured an orchestrated campaign of war, policy, and forced cultural change whose consequences are present in law and politics today. By 1890, the census's technical statement of closure overlapped with concrete changes on the ground, fences, windmills, rail spurs, county lines, that made the word frontier less useful to those living there. The Wild West in real life was therefore not a prolonged duel at high noon but a compressed period of labor, regulation, and contested sovereignty. Cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws were recognizable figures within larger systems that determined what could happen and what would last. To understand the period is to read brand books alongside court records, to plot railheads and water sources as carefully as famous names, and to acknowledge that the enduring story is not just about daring but about the organization of space and power. That recognition does not diminish the drama, it restores proportion. The West that emerges from verifiable facts is less tidy than its legend and more instructive, a study in how a society extended itself across distance, how markets and laws work together to shape behavior, and how those choices left marks on people and land that remain visible long after the cattle trails faded from the grass. Kindly comment, share and subscribe for more history.